Now, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, 4Air. 4Air is leading the way with the industry's first framework to address aviation's climate impact, offering clear, verifiable pathways to reduce and counteract aircraft emissions. Their new Assure SAF registry is making it easier than ever to manage and claim sustainable aviation fuel usage across the value chain. Want to learn more? Check out the show notes.
I don't think we can expect individual economic actors looking out only for their own interest to deliver the optimal outcome for wider society. That's why we regulate things. That's why we've regulated lead in petrol. That's why we've regulated smoking.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simply Flying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Patrick Edmond, the founder of Alter Advisory. He's also currently the Chief Marketing Officer of Future Energy Global, a sustainable aviation fuel credit developer, but today he's speaking in a personal capacity. Why do I have Patrick on this podcast? Because he and I got into, let's just say, a sort of a debate over on LinkedIn on demand management and whether demand management is a myth or can it truly reduce emissions from aviation. I learned a few new insights from my trip to the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year, and I felt strongly that, demand management is a myth. Patrick, on the other hand, felt it's not. It's part of every single major aviation decarbonization roadmap, and we had a healthy debate about it. Lots of people chimed in, and we felt, let's try something new and different on this podcast today. So Patrick and I are going to debate this out with the help of Dirk Singer, Simply Flying's head of sustainability. Tell us how you feel about this episode in comments or just email us podcast@simplyflying.com.
All right. Well, welcome to this special edition of Sustainability in the Air. This week, for a change, I'm actually going to be your host as opposed to Shashank, because we've got Shashank Nigam and Patrick Edmond with us. And the purpose of today's podcast is really to look in the issue of demand management. And the way that this came about, as many of you will have seen, Shashank was in Davos just after the new year. And he released a series of videos and a newsletter with a number of conclusions, one of which where he cast doubt whether aviation demand management is really something that's sustainable in the short to medium term. And Patrick then published a rebuttal on LinkedIn, and we thought it might be an idea to have these two gentlemen with us and to exchange views in a very friendly manner. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick off the topic. We're going to give both of them a chance to, just to very, very briefly in a minute or two, just to give a brief explanation of their position. And then we will carry on with some questions for the both of them. So Shashank, as you published that video in the newsletter, why don't we kick off with you? Why don't you just tell us in briefly, what is your position and why is demand management dead from your point of view?
Thank you, Dirk, for that kind introduction. Let me go back and zoom out a little. I think both Patrick and I share a love for aviation. Mm-hmm. We are, all three of us, I think, are products of aviation, and we intend to preserve the magic of flying for our future generations. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and I think we are very well aligned on that. Now, having said that, my biggest, one of the biggest realizations I had in Davos at the World Economic Forum was when I hosted an aviation, airline and airport CEO roundtable breakfast. And guess what? The interesting conclusion from that roundtable of CEOs was next 4 to 5 years, we are going to be pursuing growth, 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 not sustainable growth, growth. And
Mhm.
I was astounded. Okay, how? So the airline said, well, organic and inorganic growth, there are opportunities to buy other smaller airlines. And these are large airline CEOs. And okay, consolidation, sure. And even airports said, it's not just about growth in numbers. We often are capacity constrained, but it's about buying airports in new regions that we don't have exposure in. It's about expanding new and very interesting routes, like on the Airbus A321 XLR, which gives airports some very interesting point-to-point destinations. So the conclusion I received was, yes, climate and sustainability is there, but at least half the resources are around CSRD and reporting. The other half of the resources, or whatever they might have in sustainability, are just trying to figure out what needs to be done. Meanwhile, the rest of the organization is gunning for growth. And that's what made me think. And I think it was just around that time, I think the day before, Rachel Reeves at Davos had made just a side comment around the new runways at Heathrow. And I was thinking, wow, if the UK is expanding, not one, but 5 airports, what are we talking about in terms of demand management? So that's where my thoughts came from initially.
That's a pretty good starting point, Shashank, and I've really enjoyed the exchange online. And I'll just start off by saying I'm speaking today in a personal capacity. I work as Chief Marketing Officer in Future Energy Global, but I'm not talking for the company. I'm just talking as me personally. The original exchange, I guess, we had on LinkedIn was when you'd suggested that demand management was not merely dead, but it was a myth. I think that caused my eyebrows to go up, because if demand management is a myth, then there's an awful lot of airline revenue management departments who I don't know what they do all day, because this is pretty fundamental to how airlines work. We're managing demand through pricing. We see airports managing demand through slot availability. If you want to call up ACL UK and ask them for slots in Heathrow and watch the pitying look they'll give you, that's managing demand as well. So we've got a lot of existing examples of demand management going on in the aviation business. We've got even more examples of that coming on more and more on stream in tourism, where we see Venice introducing a fee. We see if you want to go to Bhutan, you have to pay a daily fee. If you want to go and see the mountain gorillas in Rwanda, you have to pay a fee. These are all examples of demand management. So bringing it back here to aviation, I'm actually not terribly surprised, and I think we're just going to violently agree on this. I'm not terribly surprised to hear a load of airline CEOs saying that they plan to expand. I've had various conversations with airline CSOs and CEOs, and it's perfectly rational for them all to plan to expand, because if they don't expand, their competitors will. So this is a classic tragedy of the commons issue. So, if you sit at a table with a load of airline CEOs and they all say we plan to expand, that, with respect, isn't really front page news, and because the demand management is not the individual airlines delivering that. That has to be some level above it, and we've seen that with various European policymakers. And I think that's probably something we'll get into in a bit more detail now. If we don't manage demand, if we just have unconstrained growth, then unfortunately we're not going to hit our net zero by 2050 target. It's already looking fairly dodgy. I think you'd probably agree. And if we continue to grow on current trajectories, I see no way of reaching that. So that's I suppose my starting point.
So, Patrick, I mean, if I can just interject there, I mean, can I just maybe get to sort of to what your definition of demand management is? I mean, is it for fewer people to fly, or is it to sort of to slightly put the brakes on growth, that there's a sort of a slower curve going up? I'm thinking, especially because you mentioned some of the examples you mentioned. I mean, as you'll be aware, the Venice one is not doing a particularly good job of sort of.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's been a very high profile example, but the amount they're charging visitors is very, very small. It doesn't actually change behavior in any way.
Is it €5?
Yeah, I think it's something like that. But I guess when we do demand forecasting, for example, for new route cases, we talk about unconstrained demand and constrained demand. So unconstrained is, if there's infinite capacity, how many people are likely to want to travel? And then constrained is we're constraining it based on capacity, based on fare levels or other things. So it's perfectly natural to constrain demand. We can't expect that there will be infinite flows. So in that sense, I would say that can be limiting growth, for example, whether by capacity, it can be having an impact from ticket prices, but I don't think it's possible to continue growing in an unconstrained way.
Okay. I mean, Shashank, do you want to respond to that? I mean, what is your position on that point? You're on.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, I didn't imagine I could have made you speechless.
I was dumbfounded, Patrick. Usually it's your quotes that leave me dumbfounded, which I absolutely love. So here's the reality, right? Demand management in the latest European roadmap has anywhere from 2% to 16% of carbon reduction by 2050. That's putting lipstick on a pig. I think that's outright lying, because IATA or ACI or other airports and airlines have no way of showing us how they're going to reduce demand by 16%. They say that, oh, having SAF will increase prices enough. I mean, I know we're going to talk about pricing in elasticity shortly, but I don't see how demand is going to reduce by 16% or 2% even by 2050. In fact, we expect demand to double by 2050. And that is, 2 to 3% growth every year. There are 29,000 airplanes in the air, over 45,000 in the air by 2050. Most of them flying today's technology. So jet engine, you need fuel, you need SAF. Guess what? If there are airplanes in the air, then airlines have to fill them up to be able to make money, to a point Patrick was making earlier. And we are not even accounting for, we are still talking the developed world or the Western world right now. The moment you go to where the true growth is coming from, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, India, Indonesia, now we're talking. You tell me, where is this reduction in demand going to come from?
Well, just to pick up on your last point, we're not talking about a reduction in demand. We're talking about constraining demand. People still want to travel. We agree, as we said at the beginning, flying is fantastic. We need to be able to ensure that continues in a sustainable way. And doing some comments in reverse order, the developing world, as we all know, the propensity to fly has been historically far, far lower than in developed countries. So it's not for us to engage in some sort of climate colonialism and tell developing countries what they can and cannot do. I'm really just looking in this case at what needs to happen in terms of developed countries showing the way, if you like. In talking about demand management, the most recent industry level report on roadmap to 2050 was probably Destination 2050, published a couple of weeks ago by a number of airline associations. So that's European Regions Airline Association, ACI Europe, Airlines for Europe, and a couple of others. They're forecasting 16% reduction in demand simply coming from the higher prices of SAF. So that's if you like, not some big policy measure. That's simply recognizing we have to have SAF. SAF is more expensive. That's going to have an impact on ticket price. And again, that's a set of industry bodies forecasting that. And you'd mentioned a little while ago, Shashank, Rachel Reeves, the UK Chancellor, talking about airport expansion. And I think the UK is a really good example here, because you probably have seen earlier this week the Climate Change Committee in the UK, which is a body set up under UK climate legislation, produced a report which essentially said we have to limit aviation growth until such time as technology allows us to expand it. So far from let's go out and build lots of runways, their attitude has been we need to actually limit this. So this isn't about being a spoilsport or something. This is about recognizing that whether or not we like it, we have a climate emergency here at the moment, and we need to take some steps to reduce aviation's impact on that. So aviation in the UK, I think this year is 9% of total emissions, and the projection is that by 2050, it'll be 27% of total emissions. And that isn't really a tenable trajectory, I'd suggest.
Indeed, and that kind of puts paid to this line that we hear a lot of aviation conferences of only 2.5%, which we all know is a very misleading statistic.
Yes,
because it hides the fact that for countries like the UK or indeed Ireland, it is far higher.
Yeah, that's right.
Air travel and able to travel. But picking up that point, Patrick, you mentioned that yes, I mean the regulatory body in the UK did say that. But yet at the same time, we have a Labour government which talks big on net zero. It had all sorts of grand, promises, in the very unique position of possibly expanding 5 airports in London at the same time.
Yes.
I mean, where does the kind of the reality of the situation, come into play here?
Well, I know Shashank likes quotes. I recall a quote from Alice Through the Looking Glass, where somebody says, I'm able to believe half a dozen impossible things before breakfast, and I can't comment on the consistency of going big on net zero and at the same time expanding runway capacity. So I'm not going to speak for the UK government. I don't think my ego is that large, but I think that if we look at what the alternatives are, we can either say, okay, there has to be some recognition of aviation's climate impact, and we need to think about how we address that. And that's not going to be the airlines who are doing that themselves. I mean, that's like saying, we have a meeting of the local burglars and they're all agreeing to voluntarily reduce their number of burglaries. It's actually the police who are going to have to decide that.
Did you just call my roundtable a roundtable of burglars?
No, I didn't at all. I was using an analogy. It's a figure of speech. But I think that, and again, as I mentioned, I've talked to a lot of airline folks, as I know you have, Shashank and Dirk, and what they'll say in private is actually very different to what they'll say in public. And the private conversations are along the lines of, yeah, we really have a problem here, but we don't see a way out of it. I had one conversation with a very senior person who said, what we'd really like is much harder regulation that would hit us all equally, because then at least, we wouldn't be competitively disadvantaged by going out and spending more on sustainability. So the truth of the matter is the individual airlines are being completely rational economic actors. I'm not faulting them for that. But within that system, there has to be some policy input if we want to reduce that unconstrained growth. Maybe we don't want to reduce that unconstrained growth. I mean, I think if we look at the other side of the Atlantic at the moment, anything resembling regulation seems to be out the window in the current US environment. But actually, you probably have to bleep that last word, because I don't think I'm allowed to say environment and US together at the moment. So I think we have to decide, we either let this just grow, and of course it has climate impacts, or we think about how equitably we can manage that growth.
Shashank, how do you respond to that?
I'm in the US right now, and I know, Patrick, what you're talking about. I feel the sentiment. The last 4 weeks here have been nothing short of extraordinary. And yes, don't use the word sustainability, use energy resilience. The coolest word I heard recently was energy dominant. Was not just resilience and energy dominant, is what you go for. And that's still putting lipstick on a pig. It's just doing something same but different, as they say in Thailand, right? Going back to your original point, that we need stronger regulations. I had 2 conversations, and also that behind the scenes people are saying different things. One was with Luca Eubank, which was just this week's podcast.
And yes, it was an interesting listen, by the way, Shashank, and demand management appeared to be far from dead listening to that.
From the policymakers' perspective, yes. Now, it is true that airline lobbyists, airline CEOs are saying something different behind closed doors, and something else publicly for managing their reputation. But at the base of it is the sheer lack of binding policy frameworks. Policy frameworks often guide or advise. They are seldom binding. EU ETS, I think, is binding to some airlines in certain jurisdictions.
Yes.
But that is an exception. We've seen what happened at Schiphol, for example, where they tried to introduce the cap. KLM sued Schiphol and won and managed to, the cap is no longer there. We've seen what happened in the UK, like you mentioned, when the government was cornered with pursuing growth, economic growth, versus their sustainability goals. Guess what they chose? They went for growth.
Sure.
And we are still in Europe, which has the willingness and the ability to regulate. If you heard J.D. Vance talk about taking away all regulation in his recent speech at the AI Summit in Paris, I don't think the US is going to regulate. In fact, they feel they're already
you reckon? Yeah, sure.
over regulate. So I don't see governments coming here and playing a legally binding role, giving airlines a fair playing field, what you will have is islands of regulation which impact only those airlines. And then guess what? Those airlines are going to go up in arms saying, you are unfairly impacting me and not others. So, for example,
Sure.
Lufthansa may be imposing, I think it's a €70 SAF charge on all tickets starting soon, or they're already doing it on all long haul flights. But guess what? All I have to do is, if I'm flying to Singapore, I'll fly Turkish. They don't do that. They don't
Sure.
need to do that.
And that's very much the Lufthansa and the Air France talking point. You're absolutely right. That's carbon leakage. Hence the reason why the European Commission is looking at applying a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, to air services. So in the same way that if you import steel from, let's say, India to Europe, you basically have to pay an import charge, which is equivalent to what the emissions charges would be if you'd produced it in Europe. What they're looking at now is applying something similar to deal with that level of carbon leakage. So I think that the fact that US policy is applying full reverse thrust at the moment isn't in itself a reason to say, hey, we can't do demand management. Demand management. If you speak to the European Commission, they're still very committed and moving forward with this. As you'll know, and as I think your previous guest mentioned, the Commission is mandated to report next year on whether the implementation of CORSIA is in line with the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree goal. Now, the dogs in the street can tell you that it's not, because CORSIA is delivering pretty much homeopathic levels of emissions reduction. So that would mean that EU ETS would be extended to full scope from 2027, all flights out of Europe, including long-haul flights. Of course, we'll have the mother of all transatlantic trade wars at that point, assuming that Europe hasn't been invaded by US forces. So I think, and I in no way minimizing the difficulty of implementing policy, but I don't think that's a reason for us to say, oh, we shouldn't even try. Just to tell you very quickly, a couple of really interesting academic papers that I refer to quite a bit. There's a really interesting paper by Stefan Gösling and his collaborators modeling airline profitability under different growth scenarios. And he modeled this relatively extreme scenario where traffic stays at 2019 levels. It's just capped at 2019 levels. I'm not saying it's practical or desirable, but it's capped. What happens to airline profits? They quadruple, because all of a sudden fares have gone up and airlines are now colossally profitable. I'm not suggesting that's a good thing, but I'm just saying there are different ways of looking at that. And the last thing I'd say, just to what you were mentioning, Shashank, is another really good academic paper that I recommend to everybody is one by Lamb and collaborators called Discourses of Climate Delay. And this is wonderful. This is basically looking at excuses for doing nothing and putting them into a little taxonomy. So, there's 4 categories of excuses. There's, we're not responsible, it's somebody else. What about China? But what about those other guys? But we'll be disadvantaged. There's,
what about
shipping? Exactly. Yeah, you're getting the hang of this. This is great. The other one is,
done this a million times.
The other one is, yeah, we can fix all this. Let's do this by recycling our coffee cups. In other words, as the solutions are this is back to what we've talked about, greenwashing all along, because there are solutions, but they're not addressing the big problem. Another way of doing it is to say, oh, but if we have this change, then there's going to be downsides. Then working families can't afford to travel. This is anti-democratic. We've heard that one as well. And then the last one is to say, well, there's no point in doing anything. The die is cast, so hey, let's just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we fry. So there are different ways of looking at this, but I prefer not to give up hope that it is possible to do something.
So what about shipping? Actually, SEMA is something that Michael O'Leary has used. And that actually doesn't work very well, because what about shipping? The IMO is actually doing quite a lot.
Yes, they are. They absolutely are, and they are recognizing the responsibility for international emissions, and they're actually going further than aviation on this. Exactly.
They're going much further.
Yeah. Yes, but just sort of to move the topic on a little bit. I mean, Shashank, one of the the most striking things you said in your news that Patrick picked up upon was this idea of not the green premium but the gilt premium. And I wonder if we could just talk about that. So, Shashank, why don't you just explain to us what you meant by that, and then give Patrick a chance to respond.
So, Dirk, I truly believe, and this is something both you and I and our team has reported, that for any technology, to make a mark and have substantial take-up rate in getting aviation to net zero, they can't rely in the long term on government subsidies, on green premium being a reality other than really at the beginning. They have to compete, unfortunately, with subsidized fossil fuel. They have to compete with technologies that exist today. And I'm seeing hope here because I see the likes of Jet Zero, which say, you know what, we will have a blended wing body aircraft, which will actually reduce fuel burn.
Mhm.
And guess
Sure,
what?
sure.
Hence, you have to use less SAF. Or I'm seeing Truckee Tahoe Airport, which is selling SAF at a rate, or SAF, sorry, I have to clarify, a blend of
Thank you.
SAF,
Thank you.
30,
Yes.
70 blend of SAF, which is the maximum they can do. They're actually selling it at the rate that's the same as Reno, Nevada's airport selling Jet A1. Not much more, which is, people keep talking about the price premium. And
Not,
I'm
not,
seeing
not, 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 not in the US. They don't, because the US has incentives but no mandates, and we can talk about SAF prices and how US airlines will not pay any extra for SAF at the moment. So
Thank you. And that's my last point,
yeah.
Patrick, which is the more airlines I'm speaking with in the last 1 month, I have spoken with at least 3 airlines that are currently negotiating with both US and European SAF providers around optics.
Yeah.
And the pricing they want is same as jet fuel, not 2x, not 3x, not 5x.
Correct.
So technologies from SAF to eSAF to, regardless of the pathway of SAF, will need to compete on their merit. Otherwise, green premium is just guilt premium, and you can no longer guilt airlines into paying more.
No, I don't. I agree with you that last part. I don't think you're going to guilt airlines into paying more. Guilting airlines is not the way I would put it. In the US, as you say, there's no premium available at the moment for SAF because there is no mandate. In Europe, there's a mandate. Airlines have to upload SAF, or more particularly fuel suppliers have to supply SAF, and SAF is trading considerably more expensively than Jet A. In other parts of the world, it's much more expensive than Jet A because the airlines who are buying it are doing so voluntarily. So I wouldn't call that a guilt premium. I'd say that's, if you like, a good global citizen premium. They actually want to signal that they're doing something to reduce their emissions, and they are voluntarily increasing their costs by going out and buying SAF at a significantly more expensive price point than Jet A. So that's happening elsewhere because the US market, in fairness, is quite distorted at the moment with the level of incentives to producers coupled with the absence of any mandate. And I've spoken to US producers who are suggesting that actually they would be better off to take their US SAF production and put it in a big tanker and ship it across to Amsterdam and sell it in the European market because of the price disparity. So I think you're right about US SAF prices, Shashank, but at the same time, I think the idea that technologies have to succeed simply on their economic merits, I think, with respect, that probably sounds pretty good in the high altitude in Davos with the free market folks. And I'm not having a dig. I'm just saying genuinely. But if we actually want to shift our behavior and actually try to reduce emissions, we can't leave it to the individual actors. And again, and this is no dig at airlines, because airlines are rational economic actors, but they are not the ones who are going to. They don't want to disadvantage themselves. Therefore, it's going to have to be policy that shifts that. And as you mentioned, fossil fuels are already very, very heavily subsidized. We could think about getting rid of the subsidy for fossil fuels. That would be a pretty good start. We could think of a couple of other measures, but any of those are going to have an impact on the affordability of flying. So we have to recognize that there's a high level of subsidy at the moment, and things therefore are going to change.
And I guess an open question is that will it ever be possible? And a lot of SAF would used to say behind closed doors that it won't be, for SAF to have price parity, towards fossil fuels. I mean, I've spoken to a few startups, and they do claim price parity, but the way that they claim that is by selling side products that then subsidize their main product. To give you an example, I spoke to a company in Georgia that is making called Cultivate, and they're making SAF using hemp as a feedstock.
Yeah.
They say that they will have price parity with fossil fuels, but the way they'll have price parity is by selling hemp bricks as a side product to subsidize them fuel. So, of course, will we ever get to, if we're using this argument of there has to be price parity, will we ever get there? Because it just won't be possible. And
I think,
if I may,
yeah, go on.
If I may jump in, Dirk, actually, this is how a traditional oil refinery works. You have a slew of products that are being made, from waxes to different types of kerosene to Jet A to your gasoline for the car, or petrol or diesel. That's what the SAF companies are doing or will need to do. They'll have the waxes that they sell to L'Oreal for net zero cream. Sure, that's where they make a lot of money. And ultimately, they will have to get the Jet A part of it, of SAF, at price parity with Jet A1 fuel. And I think that's the economic model that and any A to J SAF refinery or an eSAF plant will need to consider, that you're not only selling to airlines. Where do you make the money, and where do you drive actual sustainability goals, for example?
I think that, and by the way, Dirk, you're absolutely right about the kind of byproducts as well. And even just to mention very quickly, in my day job, part of what goes on there is the Scope 3 credit certificates from SAF are very much in demand for corporates who want to compensate for their own business travel emissions. And that has the effect of reducing the net cost of SAF to airlines. In my experience, it doesn't reduce it quite down to Jet A. I think if we are relying on price parity with Jet A, with subsidized Jet A, I don't think that's going to lead to happiness. Right now, the SAF market is far from mature. In the US, it is driven by competition between different state incentives as well as federal incentives, whose longevity is perhaps in question. Let me be diplomatic. Therefore, we don't quite know how that's all going to play out. I say what I said before. I don't think we can expect individual economic actors looking out only for their own interest to deliver the optimal outcome for wider society. That's why we regulate things. That's why we've regulated, what examples will I give you? That's why we've regulated lead in petrol. That's why we've regulated smoking. These are examples of bad things. I'm not trying to... CFCs, Montreal Protocol, that's a good example. But these are all cases where there's a recognition that societal goods require some level of, some level of limitation of individual profit maximization. That's, I don't think that makes me a Marxist.
Yep. And I think I can share a good example here, Patrick, to actually come on your side of the camp, which is Singapore Changi Airport.
Yeah,
Grew up
absolutely.
in Singapore.
Absolutely.
I know how they work and how the thinking there is. And I think it's one of the best implemented SAF policies from an ecosystem. I can't even say it's an airport. So basically, simple thing: every airline ticket out of Singapore will have a surcharge.
Yeah,
and it's ranging from $2 for a short-haul flight to Kuala Lumpur or Bangkok, to $7 for a medium haul to India or China.
Yep, and
$12 for a long haul to London or New York.
Sure.
Now, if I'm flying out of Singapore Changi Airport and I'm paying $1,000 round trip in economy, is $12 enough to not make me fly or go over to Johor Bahru to, find an alternative airport? I don't think it's going to make me go away. And this is where I think the smart part is. They're actually earmarking these funds to directly fund SAF purchases from the local nest.
That's right.
This is what most governments have not done. I mean, you look at the APD in the UK, all of the collections go to the bottomless pit of the HMRC without necessarily benefiting aviation. And I think this is what we need from policymakers. Hey, can we just cordon this off so that it helps aviation, and specifically?
No, I think you're right, Shashank, and that is a significant ask of pretty much all of the airline associations that I'm familiar with. That if there is going to be some levy on ticketing, it should at least go towards sustainable aviation and helping to make aviation more sustainable rather than going into the bottomless pit. So I completely agree with you there. And I think the Singapore approach is very good. I think that the price levels that you've mentioned, or the tax levels, the levies that you've mentioned, are not big enough to change anybody's behavior. I don't think that's for 100% SAF, though. I think as we increase the SAF blending percentage, we're going to see significantly bigger numbers. And again, I go back to what the Climate Change Commission report in the UK said this week, where they were suggesting that, if we're looking at 100% SAF, that could be adding, for example, they said in 2050, a return ticket from London to Alicante would increase by about £150, and a return ticket from London to New York would increase by about £300. So that's what they're looking at further out. And those start to become numbers where they might influence your decision. If you have a holiday home in Alicante and you go down there every month, but now it becomes £150 dearer for each of you in your family of four to go down, maybe you don't go every month, maybe you go every 6 weeks. Maybe something changes, maybe you sell the holiday home. I don't know. But the point is, it's becoming a difference which is material in your decision making.
So, I mean, Patrick, that leads us on to the next point about, who gets to fly and who decides who gets to fly.
Yeah.
Because first of all, I mean, let's take Europe before moving to the so-called global south. I mean, you mentioned Alicante. Do we really want to go back to a time, sort of 30, 40, 50 years ago, where air travel was something, sort of restricted to people with lots of time and lots of money, and for the mass of people that it wasn't. And of course, then looking at a broader level, will putting £150, €150 on a ticket to Alicante, what difference will that make when IATA says that most of the growth is going to come from Southeast Asia and China and India? And again, bearing in mind that, as we all know, 80% of the world does not fly. Who are we, all of us who've flown here a lot, to tell the other 80% that they can't? And what kind of, and is there any responsibility on their side to, sort of to mitigate their emissions from flying? And Patrick, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Dirk. And first of all, I would say I don't think we have any right to say, for example, to Indian Airlines, no, you can't expand. Because clearly, or anywhere else that you like in the global south, because this is traffic coming from an incredibly low base. You can easily see the economic and social benefits of being able to fly for 2 hours instead of spending 48 hours on a train or whatever it is. So that's extremely clear. It's less easy perhaps to see the economic and social benefits of being able now to fly from some small secondary airport in Europe to some other small secondary airport in Europe, as opposed to just driving an hour on each side to get to a bigger airport. So I think we're implicitly talking about what has to happen to the growth of flying in developed markets. At least that's the way I'm looking at it. I'm not trying to limit what happens in the developing world at all. But I think the point you make, Dirk, is a good one about who gets to fly. And again, I go back to discourses of climate delay. One of them is appeal to social justice. This means that this activity will only be available to the rich. And what does it mean to ordinary hardworking people? And I'm not being flippant about it. But sorry, go on.
But just because that argument is made by, in this case, bad actors, it doesn't mean that it's not correct.
No, you're absolutely right. And you and I have talked about this as well in the past. There are different ways of applying some sort of, let's call it carbon taxation, or some kind of charging mechanism to air tickets. The problem is not Mr. and Mrs. Smith who go on holiday to Alicante once a year. The problem is, the problem is me, or the problem is you, or the problem is Shashank, people who travel a great deal. So it's the frequent flyers who are really the problem here. And therefore, that's why, like you, I think, I have a sort of philosophical attraction to this idea of a frequent flyer levy, which, for example, ICCT and Dan Rutherford and his colleagues in the US have proposed. I don't know how that gets implemented. I can see that it would be challenging, but I don't think that's impossible. And I know there's been other work done on that more recently. And again, back to that Climate Change Committee report from the UK, which I think is really interesting and really topical. One of the, for me, quite innovative things that the Climate Change Committee did was they actually brought together citizens panels to ask ordinary people what did they think of these different measures. And so the report is well worth reading. I would recommend it. But amongst the things that those citizens panels said was they absolutely understand why flying would need to get more expensive. They think that the cost needs to fall on the tickets as opposed to government subsidizing that. But they also don't want, how will we put it, ordinary people who travel rarely to be disproportionately affected by that. Those seem like perfectly reasonable conclusions to me.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Shashank, from your perspective, I mean, you've obviously, you've lived in a lot of different places in your life. You were born in India, you grew up in Singapore, and then, you spent a lot of your adult life in Canada, and you're now Canadian. I mean, based on that perspective, I mean, how would you answer this question and come to it? And I know that you were airlines in India over Christmas as well.
I did. I'll give you a really good example, which I love. I call it demand substitution, not demand management. Did we really need North Atlantic flying a 10th daily nonstop from the UK to Disneyland?
No,
I'm not
no, we
sure.
didn't. No.
But North Atlantic tried to do this for 2 whole years and lost a lot of money doing that. But now North Atlantic is being very smart about it and wet leasing their entire 787 fleet, or no, at least a bunch of them, to Indigo in India. And guess what Indigo is doing? They're flying it from Delhi to Bangkok. and then in the later months from Delhi and Mumbai to Europe. And guess what? That's a market where firstly there is spill. There's so much demand that there's spill. Delhi, Bangkok, you can fill up with your eyes closed and make money on that flight as well, right? That's demand substitution. I think European carriers can be smarter instead of trying to just fill their own plane by themselves using the traditional old routes, Athens to LA and Dublin to Orlando or a secondary airport near Orlando. Hey, let's be smart about this. Can we at least this? Air Baltic does this and makes a lot of money. Now
Sure.
Norse is doing it, making a lot of money. High Fly in Portugal goes under the radar, but I think one of the smartest. Their brand new A330 Neos. Guess what is one of their best routes? It's deployed from Brunei to Dubai. High
Yeah,
yielding, full flight, no other non-stop. Hey, let's
and
go for it, right?
I absolutely agree with you. So these kind of ACMI, these wet lease providers, are footloose and are able to go where the demand lies if they can find a contract there, and that makes total sense. And I think if we talk about, we're talking about developing countries, talking about developed countries. For me, and we keep hearing this from IATA, from ICAO, from others, aviation is a global industry. If there is to be some sort of limitation on growth, for example, okay, we'll make that a global level limitation. And then you say, okay, developing countries get more growth. Developed countries, no, they don't get so much growth. They don't need it anymore. So, let's parcel out the growth. I'd like to be a fly on that wall.
I think that's an interesting one. I think that's a very hard argument to win, Patrick, because as much as I agree in principle, I don't know who's going to impose this policy. Schiphol couldn't even impose a cap on itself, right?
Yeah.
And they had to push it back. And also, let me make one more point. I truly believe that the only real way of demand management for the purposes of sustainability and achieving sustainable growth in Western Europe and North America is to stop building new runways. If you build more runways, airports will do everything they can to sell those slots. Airlines will do everything they can to fill those airplanes. And I'll give you a simple example. If we think making aviation more expensive is going to slow things down, we are mistaken. And I've got numbers here. The APD in the UK, which is the world's most expensive tax on any passenger ticket, by the way, the APD in the UK has gone up since 2010 till date by, I'm going to get my figures absolutely correct here. The APD has gone up 16% since 2010, yet UK international passenger numbers are up 36%. Explain that, right? The world, people are not avoiding it. They're still flying. So the only way you can achieve real demand management is not sending policy signals because they're not minding, or even implementing policies on little islands because people can skirt around those, is by stopping building new runways.
I'll actually agree with you wholeheartedly on that last point. So I think we can completely agree on that. Think about the mechanism by which stopping building the runways actually implements demand management. It means it limits capacity. It means if I want to fly on this flight, I have to pay more. It means fares are higher. Gosh, that's having an impact. Yes, totally. No. I absolutely agree.
Profits, have you seen British Airways' latest profits up 22% year on year? Crazy.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, APD, I'm not going to go down the APD rabbit hole because it's basically an example of probably how not to do things in aviation taxation terms. But what I would say is, I think conceptually we could say there is some point at which price increases have an impact on demand. Aviation demand is not price inelastic. If I am Irish and I live in London and I want to go home to Dublin for weekends and it costs me €99 round trip to do that, I'll do that with a certain frequency. If it suddenly costs me €499 round trip, I'll do it with a different frequency. We've seen this with time going the opposite direction. We've seen this when Ryanair came into the market and fares came way down, traffic went way up. So I think we can see that there is some price demand relationship. But I think back to the point you made, Dirk, I think rather than this taking a simplistic view of, let's just put prices up on everything, I completely recognize that's, how can I put it? That's very indiscriminate. That's threatening to somebody who says, look, I only fly once a year. Why should you be going after me? IATA has published figures to say that the average person in the world flies every 22 months. And that sounds like, wonderful, we're all flying every second year. Actually, that's not it at all. That's like saying the average person in the world has one ovary and one testicle. There aren't that many people around like that. and therefore I think what that's actually hiding as a statistic is that, there's a group of people who fly not at all or very, very rarely in their lives, and there's another group of people who fly relatively very frequently. So, sorry, Dirk, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and that's, I think that, really brings us to the next point, because I realize we're starting to run out of time. So I want to move on to, can we innovate our way out of this? Now, Patrick, you see that I, talk to startups all the time, and I'm
Yes.
on LinkedIn for a certain amount of magical thinking, and hoping that these things are going to sort of get us through. And Shashank is in the hotbed of innovation. He's based near Harvard, and so a question for both of you: Patrick, is there a lot of magical thinking going on, and is there, will we be able to innovate our way out? And then Shashank, what is the plan B? If we can't innovate our way out of this. So Patrick, again, why don't we?
I think there's a lot of really good innovation going on. I think that's fantastic, and it's really, really good to see. And let's have more of it. Let's keep doing what we're doing. I think that's absolutely tremendous. One of the things that we've debated online over the last couple of years, Dirk, as you'll know, is the characteristics of greenwashing. What is it that makes greenwashing? And it's not about whether an airline is doing something good or not. It's about taking it out of context. And context is everything. So here's a wonderful new startup, greatly to be encouraged. But even if they do what they are saying they're going to do, it's going to move the needle this much on total aviation emissions. Should they do it? Yes, absolutely they should. But we shouldn't think that's what's going to solve it. So the analogy, if you like, is, I'm thinking, okay, imagine you're on the Titanic, but it's actually before it hit the iceberg. It's half an hour before it hit the iceberg, but you're sailing through iceberg-infested waters. Okay, so there are innovators figuring out ways to put extra bracing on the bow so that it's less likely to fall in if it hits an iceberg. There are other innovators developing new kinds of, life jackets or faster lifeboat deployment mechanisms. This is good. They all should absolutely do this. All I would say is, at the same time, how about if we slow down a little bit? How about maybe if we steer away from the iceberg zone, in addition to all that other stuff? That's all I'd say.
Shashank?
Thank you, Dirk. And thank you, Patrick. I can see how passionate you both are regarding solutions. So here's a non-obvious solution. Patrick, I think you highlighted it's the frequent flyers who need to do something about this.
Yep.
I love Dan Rutherford. He's the only guest I've had twice on the podcast till date in the last 3 years. And I like his suggestion of a frequent flyer levy, which Dirk and I both support in principle. I just don't know how to implement it. I don't know who's going to implement it.
Especially since the key thing about the ICCT levy, it is not there to punish people for flying.
Correct.
It is there to pay for decarbonization. So it's a very different.
Yes, and sorry to interrupt, Shashank, but that's a really important point, Dirk, because we talk about the tobacco industry and we talk about other things like that, but the intention is not for that to be a sin tax. The intention is simply that is capturing the externalities, the emissions related effects, and allocating them appropriately.
Absolutely. So here's something lateral. I was sitting and thinking, okay, how do I end this debate on a positive note? And there's a silver lining, which I discovered, which is quite lateral. Everyone knows about the recent British Airways changes to Aviation or IAG, British Airways, right? No, I don't think anyone outside British Airways has been a huge fan of it, especially if you held or currently hold silver or gold status. Dirk and I have ample chats.
Yeah, I'll be losing my status next year as a result of this.
Exactly. Now here's the thing. Here's the silver lining. If you have to spend £20,000 per year to gain BA gold, guess what? You're a corporate traveler. You're a business traveler. Your company's paying for this travel. You know what? The propensity to pay for SAF and for decarbonization efforts and carbon credits is way higher on the business side than on the individual side. Airlines that try to sell offsets in their booking path get anywhere from 0.3% conversion to maximum, I've heard, is 6% conversion.
Lufthansa's done 11% on their internal German fares, but that is also because there's a large corporate take up on those, and getting extra frequent flyer miles might have something to do with it. Who knows?
You never know. That's a bit convoluted. But my point is, if BA and now Lufthansa and other companies, airlines are focusing more on the corporate traveler, they're much more likely to get these corporates to pay for staff and other carbon abatement measures, while at the same time taking away those guys who were, let's say, hubbing out of London and instead flying, they'll fly some new ultra low cost or a non-stop flight instead, a more efficient routing instead of trying to gain status miles. And this will lead to involuntarily getting frequent flyers to one, fly a little less, and second, fly more direct routing, which are more efficient, and at the same time ensuring that the airline gets more carbon abatement from corporates rather than trying to peddle them to individuals with a really low take up rate. And on one final point, which is I did an experiment. When Dirk sat me down a few years ago in London and made me calculate my carbon footprint, I almost fell off my chair.
Mhm.
I was a vegetarian. I was driving an electric car. I used to live in British Columbia. We had clean and green energy. And yet, my carbon footprint was 2x the highest per capita country in the world. I'm thinking, what in the world? And it was all due to my flying at that
Yeah,
time.
absolutely.
So a few years ago, I had taken 45 flights.
I think you've
Uh,
been doing that. I think once you said
I-
70 or something like that.
I'd taken 71 flights a few years ago. We are in the industry. So, and I know a lot of people who do more than 100 flights. I've taken 71 flights. And I said, you know what? I'm going to be just conscious about my flying. I didn't say necessarily I'll cut it. I'll just be a bit more conscious. I brought it down to 45 flights
Mhm.
just before COVID. Then COVID hit and there was no flying. And the year after COVID, I did only 15 flights. I managed to cut my flying by 5x. And that was only because I was consciously thinking about it. And I think that's something all of us
I think that's
in our own life.
I think that's very good, and that ties into, we all should be thinking about flying less. We all should be recycling. We all should be cycling rather than driving to the shops. And I'm not dissing this at all, but that's an individual narrative. And as you both know, the idea of individual responsibility for individual carbon footprints, comes from our favorite oil and gas industry, because that takes away any suggestion that systemic change is required. So we should absolutely all be thinking about, do we need to take that flight? And I completely agree with you, but I don't think we should be guilting people to say, oh, it's your fault if you take this flight, because people have all manner of good reasons to fly. Sometimes they may not have good reasons to fly. And if flights are too cheap, then you don't actually assess whether it's important or not. In the same way that if I'm buying some item of clothing and it's ridiculously cheap because it's fast fashion made by, child labor in some Oriental country, if it's incredibly cheap, I don't think about whether I really want it or whether it's durable. If it's more expensive, I'm going to say, do I really want this? Is it going to last long enough? And I think that and this came up, Dirk, you'll remember in the panel we did at Aviation Carbon, we talked about the concept of flying with purpose. There has to be a reason for the trip. And flying is a significant enough and a consequent enough thing to do. We're doing something amazing. We're traveling through the air to somewhere 1,000 kilometers or 10,000 kilometers away. And it's also consequential in terms of what it does to the environment. So we need collectively to think about that as a serious action. And I think what we've been talking about over the last hour or so, different ways of pricing that, different ways of capturing the seriousness of it, needs to be factored into the decision process.
We've reached our time. So Shashank, as it's your show, why don't you wrap up for us?
Well, firstly, I have to thank Patrick for being so gracious to join this debate after firstly calling me out. And then I think lots of people wanted to see us on stage do this. I was like, why wait? Why don't we just give this a shot and try something new? So thank you. I truly believe that, yes, we must not give up on policy around reducing demand. I question the effectiveness of policy in helping us reach that goal. And that's why I said there've got to be stronger mechanisms, be it not just deciding not to build new runways in the developed world, to and ensuring that airlines and airports are more profitable, because then you're not trying to just fill up empty planes, for example, on a new runway. Two, lateral silver linings like the devaluation of a frequent flyer program, shifting its focus to corporates, which then leads to more carbon credit sales rather than trying to sell them to individuals, like you said. So systemic change, Patrick.
So listen, from my side, thank you very much for that discussion. I think it's been a lot of fun. Shashank, we should consider maybe doing that live at some point. Maybe we can sell tickets for charity or something, in a good cause, as opposed to just putting them into the general government revenue budget like APD. But seriously, I think it is important that we debate what the different ways forward are on this, because we can't reconcile continuing business as usual with what's happening in climate terms, and aviation is really front and center for this. So this is going to be the kind of question we're going to continue debating. And I know, Shashank, you like quotes, so I leave you with a quote from William Blake, who is the English writer and artist from 200 years ago, who said, "You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough." So we're getting a certain sense of what might be more than enough. And we haven't even talked about tourism today, but if you go to Barcelona or to Dubrovnik, you get a definite sense of what is more than enough. So now it's for us collectively to figure out, how do we get to enough?
Fantastic.
And on that note, we will wrap it up. And thank you, gentlemen, for this very intriguing and interesting discussion.
And thank you
very
Dirk,
much
for hosting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Meera Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimen is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.